Hi, everybody. It's April 1st, which means it is day 13. Is that right?
Day 13, and finally out of March and into April, we've made it to another milestone towards, working our way through this school year. So it's good to see everybody. And Penny, April
Yeah.
1st means what?
National Poetry Month. But actually, I think it should be National Poetry Day, like every day of the year. But I love this
Right.
time of year.
Yeah, I think when you say National Poetry Month, it sort of, kind of lends an idea that this is the month of poetry and forget the rest of the year. But we try to weave poetry all the way through
Yeah.
our school years.
Yeah. So we have been talking this morning about lots of possibilities for this month, hoping that focusing on poetry can bring us all some light.
And part of the good news yesterday is we received confirmation that our proposal for NCTE in November, and at this point we're hoping that NCTE will proceed. We're planning on being there, that we have proposed a session on the teaching of poetry, along with our good friend, poet Georgia Hurd,
Ah,
and another poet whom we are going to introduce to all of you tomorrow.
and he comes from your area in LA, right?
He does.
Yeah, I'm so excited. I think that every year I get excited when we start thinking again about NCTE in the fall. It's this time of year when the acceptances come out. I'm always saddened by those who don't get in that I want to see, and those will start rolling in. But just congrats to all the people that support NCTE, the president, all the volunteers, because I can't imagine that professional organization has meant so much to me, my own professional growth.
Invaluable. And might not be too early to mention too that we're slotted for Thursday of that week, which
Again, like last year.
we'll remind everybody as we approach that. So a lot of people sometimes don't come into that conference until Friday, but if you want to see us and hang out with us after our presentation, we will be presenting that Thursday afternoon.
Yeah, and I'm working
So,
kind of hard right now, Kelly, on getting my daughter to come this year. She's a teacher,
okay,
right? Don't you think?
right,
We'll see.
right.
So,
It's
what have
my
you?
favorite conference of the year.
Yeah.
It's home, and I've been going to NCTE since I began teaching, and I just love it. It's such a celebration of the teaching of language arts.
It is. So, what have you been doing in your notebook?
What have I been doing in my notebook? Well, a couple things. Number one, our good friend Chris Crutcher, who we had on a few days ago, had the following tweet, which I think is very funny. He's talking about how the federal government is not really been taking the lead across the country that we kind of hoped that they would. He wrote, having 20 states without a stay-at-home order is like having 20 places in the swimming pool where it's okay to pee. So,
I missed that.
yeah. And so I don't know. I need a little bit of humor to counteract the horrors of what's happening. And I think it's okay for us to be transparent with those of us who are watching and say, before we went on today, before we recorded this live recording, Penny and I had a 25-minute conversation at just how heavy this time is and how heavy it is to teach. And I'm just thankful that this has given me a little bit of structure in my life, because I'm grasping a little bit of normalcy in a time like this, when even the president admits there's going to be a lot of horror in the next 2 weeks. And so I've been kind of wrestling with that in my notebook. And then we're back in school, and I have been piecing together a schedule that my district is asked me to adhere to. And so certain days I'll be meeting with certain classes online. Certain days there's staff meetings. There's certain days we're meeting in our PLCs. And I have really, really mixed feelings about it. I haven't written about it yet underneath, but that's what I'm going to write about later today. It seems to me there's sort of a value maybe in trying to keep things normal, but I also think there's a danger in trying to keep things normal when things aren't normal.
Yeah.
And so I'm trying to balance, what my district thinks is really good for kids and what I think is really good for kids.
Yeah. And I think that, last night, my daughter and I were talking about a kid who logged into her Flipgrid and just mentioned that it was the first time she got a computer to use at her house. And just like, how do you respond to that? And I loved that she went for, it's so good to hear from you. Don't worry about, the student was worried about, I've missed all this work from all these teachers, and don't worry about that. Just how are you? Are you okay? This orientation that all of us have of, we care about these kids as people, and that they're safe and that they're taken care of. And right now it's scary even to go to the grocery store. If they're going with their parents and you see people in gloves and masks, and everything has changed.
Mhm.
So in my notebook, this morning in the New York Times, they have a piece called The Quarantine Diaries. And I
Mhm.
linked it on our Padlet because it is from all over the world. People are submitting the kinds of things they're putting in notebooks. And several that I looked at had just amazing sketches. What I see out my window, what is on my desk. And so even though I resist it because I hate how my vision of what I'm sketching doesn't look like what I come up with, I did my one of the things that holds pencils and pens in my office. And again, that moment of just trying to make a page more beautiful and to capture my own attention in a different way. Instead of
Mhm.
worrying about the coronavirus, I'm sketching things. So it was a good day in my notebook.
Good, 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 good. Yeah, escapism. Like we talked about this in one of the earlier broadcasts. How much of the world do you let in? And I
Yeah.
think there's a real danger in letting too much in, and trying to balance that with some escape. And of course, part of that escape is that daily notebook writing.
Yeah. And as we talked about, like, what is today going to be about? One of the things we were struck by is the curse of helicopter teaching, and then John Warner's interview yesterday. Um, Both are about the problems of too much control in teaching. And so we talked about, why don't we just talk about some of the solutions or things that we do that help kids learn how to organize their writing. So that's kind of where we're going today.
So one of the things that he said that I really, really liked is that all writing is custom writing,
Yeah, it's a custom job.
right?
Loved that
All
line.
writing is a custom job, which means that I know as a teacher, when I collect student writing and they all start to sound the same, I'm in trouble. They
Mhm.
all feel the same, I'm in trouble, right? Because that's not customized, that is mass produced, standardized. Standardization produces standardized thinking, right? And
Yeah.
so we thought maybe today we would share this idea of one of the ways that we get kids to wrestle with their own decision making in writing is through well, we call it a strategy, but it's a central tenet of our
Mhm.
writing. And that is the idea of having kids wrestle with, they have this sneeze out on the paper, this quick write, and where do we go from here? A lot of my kids do a lot of, and yours too, I'm sure, do a lot of bed to bed writing, right? So I'm going to talk about my day at Disneyland. My uncle picked us up. We went and had breakfast at Denny's. We got to the park at 8 or 10. We went on ride A and B and C and D. And there's just sort of a blandness to it. And so this idea of maybe helping kids work with reimagining their text, and one of our favorite strategies in doing that is the strategy of using storyboards in both essay writing, which I'll talk a little bit about, and you're going to talk about in digital composition, correct?
Yeah, a little bit. I think one thing I wanted to add on to what you just said, though, is that another way that people pigeonhole story writing, especially in English class, is that they present it to kids as you're telling one story, the soccer
Mm,
goal that won the game, instead of the way most of us imagine story is, I want to tackle something really big in my life. You know, my relationship with my father, cancer, something that's a big territory, in which case, where do you start? Which scene do you show? How do
mm,
those scenes come together? Where's the
mm,
momentum in the piece? Those are the really big decisions that my fourth graders were making when I was coaching in fourth grade here in the town. And then my seniors were making as they developed these memoirs that were multi-narrator. And I just think that we have sometimes too narrow and too small a vision for the possibilities of story.
So interesting because, and I've often said I'm put off by the incorrect use of the literally in society, but literally, I received an email this morning from a senior of mine who it told, and I think I might have this briefly in a previous post. She is trying to write the story of her father being in prison. Father is now out, but he was in prison. So she came to me with this idea. She wants to write about it. And so her idea was she was going to write about, I think he was in for like 3 months, that she was going to write a chronology of day 1, day 2, day 3. And I suggested, go ahead and just start writing. Well, that was 2-3 months ago. Today I received the email, Mr. Gallagher, I'm stuck because I don't know I don't know every day. My dad can't remember every day and I don't know what to do. Suggestions. And I wrote her back and said, don't worry about the gaps. Just write what you want to write. Just write the key moments that, and maybe you transition and this becomes a different piece. Maybe it becomes a multi-genre piece. Maybe it becomes, a piece in which you recall certain moments and certain days and you wrap that around certain artifacts and things like that. Right. But I would just say, I said to her, just keep writing and see where the writing takes you. I mean, she was so locked into it had to be a sequential, even in a first draft, of spilling this out on the page that she couldn't envision. Just keep writing and seeing where the writing might take you.
You know what it reminded me of as you talked, the poem 21 by Patrick Roche, that spoken word poem I love. And the way that he leaves like 9, 8, he leaves gaps. And it's what I love about it is it disrupts. If I'm going to tell you my life story from 21 to 0, I don't have to tell you something every year. And we all do that anyway. We all revise and, eliminate pieces. But kids sometimes feel like there should be this order that doesn't exist. So great advice.
Right. And not only do they feel like it has to be this order that doesn't exist, the actual order itself paralyzes them when they feel like they can't spit out A and then B and then C and then D. My guess is that if she really stays with this, that if she really starts telling more and more and more of the story, this is going to be a completely different animal that she originally, but she doesn't see that because in school she just, she always writes A, B, C, D, E, and then I'm done. Right. So I think this is kind of what we're after when we talk about storyboarding. Do you want to put the slides up?
Yeah. So we've put together a couple slides from our work. And before I switch over, can you all see that cute little photo on my desktop?
What an accident.
Maisie, my granddaughter, saying right before this, working on my pewter, because she's trying to work just like Dad. She has her own little keyboard while he's doing his work. So tell us about Kitchen Table.
Well, in honor of National Poetry Month, a poem that you and I have used many, many times over the years is Kitchen Table, which comes from George Ella Lyon's book, Many Storied House. And in that book, she writes poems about various parts of her house, because the sort of premise of that book is, there are stories hiding in the various places in your house. And one of those places is Kitchen Table. Goes like this. This table stands where the green table stood, where they played Scrabble with the Babbages, wrote out statements for New Way cleaners, where Mother made out rolls and we sculpted Christmas candles, and she tightened the vise on the cast iron grinder that turned ham scraps to ham salad. This table where she made the calls for the March of Dimes and for the chamber, where she said I was treating her child, where I said I'm only trying to take care of her. This table stands where the white enameled table stood on which she mixed the formula for our bottles before the table we antique got carried away by the flood. This table is where she opened the newspaper to Daddy's photo, Harlan businessman, dead at 68. this is, and I can't read the last line, but it's something like, this is where she sat and howled. You know, what are the stories that have happened at your kitchen table? So one of the things you and I have done with our kids many times is we have them draft stories that have happened at the kitchen table. And one of the stories that happened at my kitchen table was when I was in junior high, I injured my finger. And this is the sequence of it. I was sitting at the table. My dad looked at it and talked. He said to me, "Don't move. I'm going to fix it." My finger had swollen really, really intensely. He goes out in the garage. He gets a power drill, and he says, "All you do is, drill a hole in that fingernail, and you will immediately feel a lot better." So he goes out in the garage and he brings in a Black & Decker power drill, and he's getting ready. You know, he starts the drill and it goes zing, zing, like that. And my mom says, "What the hell's going on?" And she comes in, she yells, "Stop." I run away. My dad eventually takes me to the doctor, and the story ends with, the doctor says, "Yeah, you'll feel better just as soon as I drill a hole in that fingernail," right? And so that's the story that I wrote and drafted in class. And I know we've talked many times about drafting in front of kids or alongside of kids, but sometimes when it's a longer piece, we do the drafting at home, and I bring it in and I showed them this essay in this form. Do you have that? I can't remember if that's the next slide since I don't have access to the deck or not. Go ahead to the actual essay. Is that in there somewhere?
Yeah, but you didn't want, okay.
Okay, so that's the way I drafted it initially, right? I'd written it that way. But if we now back up to the story, back up a couple more. That's how I had originally envisioned it. And then I cut them up. I said, this is the sequence of my story, but maybe I should start with my mom. Maybe I should start at the doctor's office. And so I'm just kind of playing that it's not necessarily A happens and then B happens and C happens and D happens, that maybe the story has a little bit more power if we move it around. And this was in a later lap of narrative that you and I did in our laps of narrative, Penny. And as part of this lap, one of the assignments was, as you tell this story, this is a more sophisticated lap, we were asking kids to flash forward or flash back. We did not want a story that just sits in one time and place. We wanted a story that flashes outward or flashes back. So as you see this, I'm looking at the sequence, and then go ahead to the next slide. I cut out, and as my dad says, "Hey, let me drill that finger," I then flash back to other times my dad did crazy stuff. And so the pieces that are in yellow are the places where I'm actually going to interrupt the flow of the narrative, and I'm going to flash forward and flash back. And I'm just moving the pieces around. Like, I don't have the answer. How many of you think I should start at the doctor's office? How many think that I should start with my crazy dad? How many of you think I should start at the kitchen table? And it's this kind of wrestling. I think that this is, as we mentioned before we came on today, this is more than a strategy. This is a way of thinking that writers, especially inexperienced writers, are not very adept at doing. And I just think boarding is a really, really powerful way to get them to think in those terms.
Well, and I think another piece that is important here is that Ralph Fletcher famously said, "Start at the waterfall, not downstream," because kids will start with, my dad and I had this relationship, and you go through this rigmarole to get to, I'm sitting at the table, because you want to grab them and get them in. But the other piece is that when I first saw this strategy used, it was in a Linda Reef workshop, and she was showing how with her students who didn't write well, this is way more than an outline. An outline is a bunch of words that don't necessarily connect to moments. It's the sketching, the few words that make it a moment. But then as kids, she had them doing it with Post-its, would tell their stories. They would then use the Post-its to tell a small writing group the story. And what she found with her 8th graders was that the kids themselves would say, you don't really need that one, or this one. And so they were doing this natural revision before they had written. and how critical it is to let kids revise and rethink a plan so they can get some flexibility with where they're going with their piece. It doesn't mean that there won't be surprises as they write, but rather you eliminate that. The kid's written a page and a half. I used to walk in all the time, elementary kids, a page and a half that is really not very interesting. And then they get to the interesting part and they're tired, they're out of steam, and the piece never becomes what they wanted it to be.
Right.
So I love this. It's a great little example of how it works. And we're just going to mention one thing. Katie Wood Ray was our editor for 180 Days, somebody we admire greatly. And she always said that students may have forgotten the importance of imagination in writing. So if they're doing too much task-oriented writing, it's taught them how to follow directions. They've been rewarded for organizing how we tell them to, and they wait for us to show them how to organize. So they don't trust themselves with these decisions. And it's that imagining. The writing in the air was always her strategy for saying to a kid, okay, so if I'm picturing your dad, what if, so that there was nothing on paper and they were allowed to use their natural oral language skills to imagine the story. And what happens here is if you imagine that in front of them, what if I move this here and I tell it this way, you're giving them the modeling that they need to go on. And so we just wanted to go a little bit farther with that and say that we believe really that digital storytelling is not used enough in English classrooms. In 180 days, we have 3 laps around digital work. And I think a lot about how in this example, I'm asking my kids to do a 1-minute story of someone who matters to them. And so the example that's on the screen on the left side is my timeline on iMovie where I'm making a birthday card for Maisie's first birthday. And look at all of the decisions that I have to make as the creator of this 1-minute digital story. And when I use this fall with my students, they chose such a range of topics, from a favorite coach to a best friend to, a sibling and a dog. But the idea of you have to make a lot of decisions. And I think that flexibility is something we teach. Because if we don't teach it, if we just give them an assignment, they're waiting for us to tell them how to do it so they get the best grade. And so I wanted to go one little place farther and say that this is also in 180 days, that this was during the argument unit when our students took their letters to presidential candidates and turned them into public service announcements about the big idea. And it was a 1-minute PSA, digital work. But we don't believe in rubrics, a topic for another one of these things we do, whatever they're called. And
session.
That's my great diction this morning. But we do talk to kids about what makes something in that genre excellent. And we do create this criteria by looking at mentor texts, looking at models, talking about what makes them good. But using this, then how do we help kids know how do you use these categories to analyze an existing text? And so I used it in a class I was teaching with the work of poetic justice. So here's another one on our wish list of who we want to bring to this group this month. Ellen Stackable, an English teacher in Tulsa, Oklahoma, decided that one of her missions in life was to bring poetry to the incarcerated women in Oklahoma. She founded Poetic Justice. She was a CNN local hero last year, made it to the top 10 finals, which was incredible. And the interesting thing for me is this is the last thing I did before I have just been grounded at home. March 11th, I was at Mabel Bassett Maximum Security Prison in Tulsa with this group of women writers writing poetry. So I asked my students in a class on story how we could look at a documentary that was created on this work and analyze it as a digital text. And so first, I introduced them to these women, to their, many of them are serving sentences that are unjust, and just looking at the incarceration issue in the United States. And as always, modeling. I took out this excellence in digital storytelling criteria, and then I said, if I was going to write about organization, then as I'm watching the movie, I would want to list examples of how the creator of the document maintains a focus on prisoners empowered by writing, because that's really the main idea. And how is the documentary organized to do that? you can see other examples explain the mix of music, voices, and voiceovers and interviews. How is the mix effective? That's under the category called media. So I gave kids like, this is stuff you might be looking for. And then they watched the documentary, took notes in their notebook. They started coming up with things, evidence from watching it that would fit in these categories. And then the key important step that connects to storyboarding is don't just say, go write an analytical essay, make a claim. I took their notes, my notes, and I sat under the document camera and said, how does this sound if I begin with media, if I begin with pacing, I have to decide as a writer how I'm going to focus people and move them through my analysis of this documentary. And as I do that, what I'm going to learn is that some of these categories go more naturally next to others. And so then they did that with their own thinking. And this is just a sample of one of my students. Within the first couple of seconds, the general purpose was clear. There was one particular image of an inmate before she was just that, with her family, wearing red. The blend of media is the third paragraph, particularly effective. This went on for 3 or 4 more paragraphs. But the key was modeling for them that if you're going to create even analysis, you have this flexibility with what do you introduce and when, instead of a tightly written timeline. So I have one other thing I wanted to say about the work that you were doing on your dad's drilling your finger, and how when you started talking about the flashbacks to who he was, that was when my interest in the story was just really heightened, because it became more than just the story of the finger. It became the bigger story of the two of you. And so when I was in that project with you, with our students, I was writing about my dad. You probably remember this, because I was telling stories about when things were hard and how they turned and got better. And in the midst of writing it, my mom hands me the only letter he ever wrote her. He happened to have written it from rehab. And my question for my class was, now that I have this, it's his voice. His voice matters in the story, but where do I put it? Should I put it here? Should I put it here? And again, I think it's that modeling that is the secret to our kids beginning to think that they have more agency in how their writing goes. That makes sense.
Well, you've modeled a whole lot more than just looking at a piece of writing. You've also modeled that you're a human being and that you're a writer, and that the way you cope with your experiences with your dad, is to bring them out. I think Chris Crutcher talked about this,
Yeah.
that one of the ways we connect with kids is we write about our lives. That really happened with my dad. That really happened with your dad, and bringing it in. But this idea, my idea of looking at somebody's essay and looking at the sequencing, and your idea of tying that to digital text, I think it's so smart, this idea of what are the decisions made behind the composition of this thing. And this is a little bit what John Warner talked about yesterday, right?
Yeah.
What are the decisions made? I think really, really opens up possibilities for kids who are in that sort of bed-to-bed writing.
Yeah. Yeah. Well,
So,
I am so excited for tomorrow. I cannot wait to have this poet
yes,
on.
tomorrow we're going to have a guest poet. And I would suggest before we sign off to also recognize very quickly that after we record these and post these, we are still, in case you missed it, we are there's a place on Flipgrid for everybody to come join the conversation. And up as we went to press today, we are approaching 10,000 people responding or not responding, but viewing on Flipgrid.
Yeah.
So we invite you to watch and even to join that conversation if you'd like to extend what we've talking about in these morning briefings.
Yeah. And I'm watching all of them. I think they're fascinating to listen to teachers from all over talk about what they're thinking about.
So thanks for joining us again. Tomorrow we're going to celebrate some poetry, and we hope you have a safe day. And thanks again for joining us. Bye.
Bye, everybody.